This is the Government on Tap series. The legislative branch, I've titled it Power and the People. So we want to start off with a quote of our, So our 44th president, Barack Obama, he made this very famous statement, there's never a bad day for a beer. So he was attending, I think, a G7 that was being hosted in Bavaria. So it was in Munich, so he said that. So, grab a beer, we'll have a good discussion. Okay. So, just as an aside, this is an interactive quiz. So, appropriately, given that we're talking about the legislative branch, most of you guys have thought the legislative branch as well. Now, this is exactly what the founders thought as well, that the legislative branch was the most powerful. If you think about it, just on the time they spent on it, Article 1 of the Constitution describes the legislative branch and its powers. It is by far the largest part of the Constitution. Okay? The executive branch gets described in Article 2, the judicial branch in Article 3, and then there's another 4. I think there's 8 articles in total, maybe 9. But the legislative branch makes up the most of it. And there's a reason for that. The legislative branch has a ton of power. Okay, and power is what defines government. What can they do? Okay, what can other things do as well? And as this little cartoon tries to show, they'd have a lot of powers about spending money, creating courts, impeaching people. They can veto appointments that the executive branch has. They put in amendments to the Constitution, okay? Override vetoes. Executive branch has some powers. The judicial branch acts in some ways as referees. They can interpret. James Madison famously, when he was it was Alexander Hamilton when he was talking about the judicial branch in the Federalist Papers. He said the legislative branch has the power of the purse. The executive branch has the power of the sword. So they run the military and they can do things. The judicial branch has nothing. They have their opinion. So in his mind and a lot of the founders, it was the legislative branch that was the most powerful. And we're going to see why. Okay? So what does the Constitution say? Article 1 is where they lay out the legislative branch. Okay? As part of what was called the Great Compromise, we talked about this last video, there was a Virginia plan that the large states would have the most representation in Congress. There was the New Jersey plan, where small states would every state would get an equal vote, which would benefit smaller states over larger states. And then there was the Great Compromise, which came out, or the Connecticut plan. And that plan structures Congress as a bicameral institution. Bicameral means 2 houses. So you have the House of Representatives and the Senate. And in that instance, both sides got something that they wanted. Okay? And again, the compromise happens because you have one house, the House of Representatives, which is based on population. The Senate is equal. They get one vote each effectively. In reality, they get 2 votes each in how they do it. Okay? And this sort of lays out the differences between the 2 institutions. Okay? The House, you only have to be 25 to be a House member. It's much easier to qualify to be a House member. You have to be a citizen for 7 years. Obviously, both have to reside in the states. A senator has to be a little more wise, have a little more life experience, as they said. And you had to be at least 30 years old. Doesn't seem that old to us, but you remember, back in the 1700s, you weren't living till 90. Okay? And a lot of the framers of the Constitution or the signers of the Declaration of Independence were in their 30s. That's the generation that built these documents. So 30 for Senate, 9 years of citizenship, service. And this was another compromise they put out. The House, you serve for 2 years, unlimited number of terms. The Senate, you serve for 6 years, and it's divided up where a third of the Senate is up for election every 2 years. And they did that on purpose because the House is supposed to be responsive to the citizens' wishes. It's called the People's House, as we'll see. They're supposed to be the ones who react to what the people want. So every 2 years, if you don't like it, get rid of them. The Senate's supposed to be more deliberative. It's supposed to have a calming effect. It's not supposed to be subject to the passions and the whims of the mob. We all want to go over here. The Senate's like, yeah, maybe you guys all do, but we're going to think about whether that's a good idea or not. And they're supposed to slow it down. So they don't have to face the electorate for every 6 years. And you can't get the Senate to turn over at least for every 4 years. So that was on purpose, okay? The constituency, anyone know what a constituent is? What's that? It is a voter, but it's more specific to a voter. A voter in that district. What's that? A voter in that district. Right. It's who that congressperson represents. Okay. So constituency for House members, it's apportioned by population, but in the Senate, it's apportioned by the entire state. Okay. I often ask this question. The purest form of representative or populism, where the people decide who their representatives is, between the presidency, the House, and the Senate. Show of hands. If you think it's the House or the presidency, 1 finger. House 2, Senate 3. Which is the best representation of the will of the people? To have their representatives represent them. President is 1, House is 2, Senate is 3. So I got a lot of 2s. All right. The right answer is really the Senate. If you think about it, most of you did not say the presidency, which is good. The presidency, we elect people through an electoral college, so we don't vote for them directly. The House, you'd think, is a good number. The problem with the House is the district that we live in is drawn in such a way where we may not have representation. And we're going to talk about that. It's called gerrymandering. You can draw the district in such a way that if you're a Democrat, your vote may not matter, or if you're a Republican, your vote may not matter. There is no gerrymandering for senators. It's the entire state gets to vote on it. So, like, from my perspective, that's the purest form of what you would call the ability to serve your constituent. It would be the state, okay? We'll go into organization in a second. Just know that the House has a lot of rules. It's very strictly organized. The Constitution, in its Article 1, says that both bodies make their own rules. They can decide how business gets done there. And they set it up that way. The House has a lot of formal structures. Leadership positions are very, very powerful in the House. Whereas the Senate, it's more of a congenial body. Everyone kind of is more of a co-equal in the Senate. Anybody can go speak in the Senate. The rules are much more relaxed. Each senator has more power in their body than an individual congressperson has in the House. Okay? And again, the goals are what we spoke about. Okay? So let's talk about the People's House. This is the Speaker of the House currently. His name is Mike Johnson from Louisiana. And the House has 435 members, apportioned by population. So what it does is apportioned by population means that each House member is supposed to represent roughly the same number of citizens. The number right now is around 750,000 people. That's kind of the average of what a House member represents. When the Constitution was written, that number was 37,000. So the country's gotten much bigger. We haven't added House seats since the 1920s. And you say, oh, Mike, we've had states since then, right? Had Hawaii and Alaska came in. Congress makes the laws around how many House seats that they have. And in the 1920s, they made a law saying, we're done, we're capping it. It's getting unwieldy. So if our country goes from 350 million, roughly where we are now, to half a billion, we'll still have 435 House seats, unless they decide to change it. Okay, so, and there are pros and cons to both. If you're the People's House, you're representing 750,000 people. It's tough to know your rep. It really is. And you're supposed to. So that's getting there. But there's also this thought, if you have too big of an institution, you can't get anything done. They have to put a wing on Congress to add all these new people. So, but that's what it means, apportioned by population. Okay? It's 2 terms, as we said. A power that the People's House has that was specifically given to them because it's tied to the wills of the people. Only the House can create new revenue bills, because that's a big deal. To tax was one of the reasons we fought the revolution. So you want the place that is responsible for creating taxes, you can vote them out every 2 years. At least that's the theory. Okay? And in the House, they came up with rules. The Speaker of the House is the only other government position outside the President, the Vice President, and then the Speaker. That's the third person who's mentioned in the Constitution. There is no other government official mentioned in the entire document. The Speaker has a lot of power. Okay? In the House, the rules are set up where most things go through the Speaker, as we'll see. The Senate's a little different. Again, 100 members, 2 per state. That's Chuck Schumer. He's the majority leader of the Senate. You'll notice, as I said, Mike Johnson, he is not the majority leader of the House. Steve Scalise is. He's the, Chuck is the majority leader. He runs his caucus, which is the Democratic caucus. Mike Johnson technically doesn't run his caucus. He runs the entire House. There's a difference. Okay? As I mentioned, Senate 6 years. And it's supposed to be insulated from the passions of the people. It's less insulated now than when the framers created it. Originally, we didn't vote on senators. Legislatures of each state picked their senators to go off to Washington to represent them. So it was one thing even further removed than the Electoral College. The 17th Amendment changed that. We now vote directly for our senators. But again, that didn't take place till the early 1900s. So for 135 years, we did not vote for senators. And again, this is a collegial body. Senators they can all get up and talk whenever they want. That's not the case in the House. You got to get the Speaker to let you speak in the House. Okay? Now, let's talk about powers. In the Constitution, there's something called enumerated powers. My juniors are like, what are you talking about? What does that mean? Enumerated just means written down. So these are powers distinctly given to the legislative body. And as we talked about when we talked about the Constitution last time, the Constitution's a document where the people give up some of their freedom because they give power to the government to do the things that the people want them to be able to accomplish. If they're not given it, they don't have it. Okay? And that's the beauty of our Constitution. these are the things that they're given. They're literally written down in the Constitution. Both chambers have a lot to do with economic policy. They can they collect taxes, they make money, they can borrow. They regulate interstate and foreign commerce. Okay, they're not allowed to regulate intrastate commerce. That's trade that goes on inside the borders of a state. But if it crosses the borders of the state, that's Congress's job. Okay. They also have something called the necessary and proper laws to carry out anything that's written down. Okay, so it's like a catch-all phrase. So you can do all these things around the economy, plus you have the power to make other laws to carry out those other powers. So they couldn't foresee all the things that they would need to do. And we'll talk about that. There's a little split amongst the economy, as I mentioned. The House can only do revenue bills. The theory is it's kind of gotten a lot fuzzier now. You will see the Senate propose budget plans. In theory, they're not supposed to do that. Nobody makes a big stink about it anymore. Okay? So you'll start to see that every now and then. They both can regulate trade. The Senate gets to confirm ambassadors for the presidency. And then in national security, the House and the Senate have a lot of power. They get to raise armies. They get to provision them and navies. They get to call on the military to, quote, execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, repel invasions. Remember, one of the things around the Constitution, they called the convention because they were aghast that there was a rebellion going on in Massachusetts that no one could put down. They didn't have the resources, which was called Shays' Rebellion. So they wanted to make sure Congress could do that. And I love this, they can punish piracy too. So they can get rid of pirates. All right. Arrgh. All right. Around the executive branch, the House can impeach the president, vice president, other executive branch officers, including cabinet members. Impeaching someone, a lot of people sometimes get confused around this. This is like an indictment, if you think about it legally. I'm not a lawyer, but they vote on charges that they want to bring against someone in the executive house. The Senate acts as a court. They're the jury. And they actually try say the president, whether they're going to be found guilty or not guilty. Okay, so one is you could think of them as the grand jury, if you ever served on a grand jury. The other would be the petit jury, where they'll find you guilty or not guilty. Okay, the judicial branch, Congress gets to make the judicial branch. They have to have a Supreme Court, that's in Article 3. But then Congress can make as many courts as they want underneath it. It's their power. And that includes defining the Supreme Court. How many judges do you want? The only thing they can't do, because it's in the Constitution, is put a term limit on judges. Judges get to serve for life in the Constitution. And when we get to the judicial branch, we'll talk about that. They can impeach judicial branch members. And again, the Senate can try them. The Senate also gets to confirm the judicial branch. And we'll talk about that. That's a big power that they have in order to check the executive. Okay? And then, like I said, they can make all laws necessary and proper to carry out their other laws. So think about this. We don't have it right now, although there's some talk of bringing it back. The draft. Did away with the draft in the late 70s after the Vietnam War. Think about the draft. The government sends you a note and says, I own you for 2 years. You're going to dress the way I want you to dress. You're going to eat the food I want you to eat. You're going to get up when I tell you. You're going to run up hills and possibly die doing it. They own you. How does that happen? Where in the Constitution does it say you can be owned by the government? The answer is it doesn't. Doesn't say that anywhere. But they are given the power to regulate the Army and the Navy, to maintain one. Because they can do anything that's necessary and proper to do that, they can create a law that tells you, come on in, son, we're going to shave your head. We own you for 2 years. And that's constitutional. Stuff, but that's what they can do. That's what the necessary and proper clause allows them to do. It gives Congress what's called implied powers. They're not written down, but they're implied by their ability to uphold these other enumerated powers. All right. Now, there are things that Congress can't do. As I mentioned, the framers thought we're going to give Congress power. If it's not written down, they can't have it. But there were some things that they thought were so egregious, had to be written down and say, no, you can't do this. And it's a big list. Part of the compromise to create the Constitution, I mentioned last time, was about slavery. Okay, this was this idea of the 3/5 compromise on what a person is. Okay, air quotes. They prohibited. They said you can't limit the slave trade for 20 years. That was a very heinous part of the slave trade. The whole thing is heinous. But watching people being bought and sold was it really upset abolitionists. They weren't allowed to interfere with it for 20 years. When 20 years came up, they got rid of it. They voted right away, no more importation of enslaved Africans. But they weren't allowed to do that for the first 20 years. Habeas corpus means literally have the body. This was something under English law. This is why Charles I got his head cut off in the English Civil War, one of the reasons. He would just throw people in jail and not charge them with anything. Could sit there and rot in jail waiting for charges. Habeas corpus means you can't do that. If you put someone in jail, you have to charge them with something. Congress can't get rid of the writ of habeas corpus. They're not allowed to just hold someone in jail, except in cases of rebellion or invasion. This was a very controversial topic in the Civil War with Lincoln. Okay, this is an interesting one. Taxes. This is how it's written. Can't impose direct taxes unless they are proportional to the census. Congress cannot tax exports from any state. What does that mean? Can't impose direct taxes unless they are proportional to the census. Any idea?
You can't tax New York because they're rich and not tax Louisiana because they're poor.
You have to tax everyone equally.
Say that again, Allison.
Tax everyone equally.
You have to tax everyone equally. You're not allowed to say that person's rich and that person's poor, and we can tax the rich person more. Not allowed. They didn't want to have people to be treated differently because of your economic status. That's written as a power you can't do.
I was thinking business-wise.
Oh.
I wasn't thinking individual.
Now, last I checked, every April 15th, I have to tell them how much I have, and they take some of it.
So is that unconstitutional?
It would be, except they passed
Another law.
they amended the Constitution, the Income Tax Amendment, I think it's the 18th Amendment, to allow you to tax people based on their wealth. They had to change the Constitution to have that to happen. This is a big deal. Completely outside what the framers thought should be done. But now we have it. Okay? And then I'll go on. This is other thing. It can't be titles of nobility. I know there are some politicians who kind of think they are they are entitled to that, but you're not allowed to do that. This is also something called a bill of attainder. This again goes back to these are what happened in some of these legislative bodies in Europe. A bill of attainder is where the legislative body acts as a judge and jury. They say, you are guilty, we're finding this person guilty of something, go out and arrest them. Congress can't do that. We have separations of power, okay? But they had to write it down around. And they can't pass any laws that would allow that to happen either, okay? And then ex post facto just means you can't pass a law that says, today, or they pass a law that tomorrow it is illegal to wear yellow ties. I was wearing one today. Then I can be tried and found guilty for something I did today when the law gets passed tomorrow. Can't do that either, okay? So these are specific things you're not allowed to do.
Mike, before you change it, you didn't mention Congress cannot tax exports from any state. Was that something that stopped them from taxing state to state?
Yes.
Or out of the country?
It's from state to state. Yeah, they can control the border with others, but they can't tax interstate commerce. Yeah. Okay. So let's go into these implied powers. All right. How did they come up with these things? Again, wasn't written down. They just put that one clause in there that they had the necessary and proper power. So this is unchallenged for about 30 years. Congress creates the second bank of the U.S. in 1816, okay? They make a banking system. They have branches all over the place, okay? Maryland decides, all right, it's a business. It makes money. We can tax. That's a power the states have, as well as the federal government. They decide to make a tax and tax the bank. They said, how much did you make this year? You owe us money. The bank teller, literally, who runs the bank in Maryland, says, I'm not paying. His name is McCulloch. He's a clerk. I'm not writing you a check. We're the federal government. And this goes all the way to the Supreme Court. It becomes McCulloch versus Maryland. And they have to decide a couple of things. Can Congress make a bank? Read the Constitution. There's no banks in there. And if they can do it, can the states tax it? States can tax. There's the question. So it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court under John Marshall, he's a Federalist. He's like the last of the Federalists. The whole party dies. They all still hang out on the Supreme Court for like 20 years. And he comes up with this thing where, can they make a bank? And the Supreme Court says, yes, they can. Because they can regulate interstate commerce, that has to do with money and buying and selling stuff, that they can, and they have the necessary and proper power, or the necessary and proper ability to carry out that power, banks fall under that. So they can make it. So this was the first case that really defined that Congress has these implied powers that aren't written down. And they can make a bank. Now, here's the other question. Can it be taxed? Why not, right? They both can tax it. Why do you think tax might be an issue?
The states can tax it out of existence.
Yeah.
There you go. They could tax it out of existence. And they can't tax it. In the Constitution, later on, there's something called the Supremacy Clause, that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And John Marshall famously says, the power to tax is the power to destroy. You could just tax it at 100% of its earnings. Bank doesn't exist. So you got to remove that ability. And so there you go. So it sets a precedent for any of you who invest in municipal bonds. One branch of government can't tax the other branch. So it applies to a lot of different things. So that's why state and local bonds are tax exempt from the federal government. And vice versa. New Jersey can't tax if you own federal debt. It's tax-free in New Jersey. Okay? But this is it. So we've got this idea of implied powers, and that's how the Constitution gets interpreted ever since. Okay? So I want to ask you this. So here's two laws. I'm going to get your opinion on this. So what law does Congress have the power to pass, meaning is constitutional? If you can't read this, one of the laws is tell a farmer how much wheat he can grow to feed his pigs. Or the other law, make it a federal crime to bring a gun into a school. Which law does Congress have the power to pass? So most of you said the right answer. All right? Congress can make a law that tells a farmer how much wheat he can grow to feed his pigs. It does sound crazy. Congress can deal with interstate commerce. Farmer's just growing wheat on his own farm. He's not selling it. He's just feeding it to his pigs. Never leaves his farm. They can make that law. Can't make a law about a federal gun or bringing a gun into a school, and we'll see why as well. And this is a weird law that Congress has the ability to do. So in the Depression, if you know anything about Depression, commodity prices had collapsed. It's too much of everything. It was deflation. And wheat prices were dropping. Farmers were going out of business. They couldn't sell wheat. So they create a law that regulates how much wheat you can grow. And they said, you know, because if they ship it to some place, there's too much wheat, the price goes down. This farmer says, you know what? I'm not doing that. All I do is I feed my own pigs. Someone came and fined him for growing too much wheat. He said, that's ridiculous. It's on my farm. What are you talking about? And it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And this is a case called Wickard versus Filburn. Gets settled in like 1941 or something like that. And the Supreme Court rules that it is necessary and proper for regulating interstate commerce because if every farmer did this cumulative effect, it would affect national grain prices. And therefore, Congress has the ability to do it. That's the legal argument. Kind of makes some sense. But if you think about it, this poor farmer is like, are you kidding me? This is ridiculous. This leads to a slew of laws that Congress gets involved in the economy. Everything becomes interstate commerce. If they can do this, they can do anything. And they do. There are some crazy laws that get created between the 1940s up into the early 1990s. Loads of crazy laws. I was going to show a video, but it's too long. There are some wackadoodle laws that have to do, in Congress's mind and the Supreme Court's mind, for their ability to regulate commerce. And that period of time between the Great Depression to the end of last century is a time where Congress's power in the economy grows exponentially, all because of the necessary and proper clause and the interpretation of what is commerce. Now this keeps going and going, and we get another Supreme Court case. This time, in 1990, Congress passes a bill saying you can't have guns in school. Makes sense, right? Well, this kid in Texas brings a gun into his local high school. And Texas has a law that makes that illegal. They arrest him for it. The feds get involved and say, whoa, you broke our law too. Our law has tougher punishments. So they drop the Texas law, they drop that one, charges, and they just try him on the federal charges. And his name's Lopez, his lawyers sue, saying you can't do that. You don't have the power. Where does it say in the Constitution you can regulate guns in schools? It's not there. The lawyers for the government argue Wicker versus Filburn. This is commerce. If children can't learn in a safe environment, they will not learn. And that will affect our workforce going forward. That's the logical argument. And, you know, it's not crazy. You could probably connect the dots to that. But the Supreme Court in the early 1990s says, no, come on. This is a state power. You can't call this commerce. You can call it a lot of things, but it's not commerce. And therefore, it's unconstitutional. The Congress can't create laws at this micro level and then call that interstate commerce. And it's the first time since Wickard-Filburn that the courts began to push back on Congress's ability to just start to make everything about commerce. And they've chipped away at it little by little, not a lot, but little by little since then, okay? And we could go on. There's all sorts of interesting cases. When I do the bureaucracy, that's where we really get into it, because there's some crazy laws around the bureaucracy, and they fight about this all the time, what the bureaucracy can do, where its power resides versus where Congress's power resides, et cetera. So this is now, this has become a much more debated thing on whether or not Congress has these implied powers. Okay? So just to go on how these laws get made, the structure of Congress. Most of stuff happens in Congress in what's called committees. And again, Congress creates their own rules. The Senate creates their own rules, House does. And they create these things called committees. And this is where 90-odd% of the work in Congress gets done, okay, inside these committees. And there's committees for pretty much anything you can think of for Congress. There's a committee for trade. There's a commerce committee. There's appropriations committee. There's a judicial committee. All these different committees. And Congress people can serve on multiple committees. In the House, congressional chairs have a lot of power, just kind of like the Speaker. They get to decide what gets done in their committee. So if you're on the Appropriations Committee and you're that congressperson, Appropriations it decides what we're going to spend our money on this year. That's a powerful job. You will get a lot of campaign contributions because you can make a lot of people very happy because you control the agenda in the committee, what gets done. If you don't want a bill to come out of that committee, it sits there, can't come out, okay? And committees are structured in the same way as the body of the House. So in the House now, there's a very slim Republican majority. So each committee reflects that. It's usually one, maybe two more Republicans on each committee than Democrats. The Senate, it's the opposite. Slim majority for Democrats. Each senatorial committee has a slim majority of senators. And they get to control the agenda in that regard. So these guys decide on what bills they're going to work on, what laws they want to try and get passed. Okay? And this is how a bill becomes a law.
Whew, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will, but today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm gonna live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be a law. How I hope and pray that he will. But today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By
old.
that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
He signed your bill. Now you're a law.
Oh, yes.
It actually, oddly enough, it's pretty good. It does describe the process pretty well. These things were great. And we all know the song. But what it says, the bill he gets written up by a congressperson. I think the thing is to have school buses stop at railroad crossings. And he goes into committee, and he's worried he's going to die there. And he's in, I think he's in the House at first. And they argue about him. Then it goes out to the floor. The speaker gets to decide whether they're going to vote on it. He votes on it. It goes to the Senate and then gets dropped back into a committee. They argue about it. They can make changes to it. They vote, yep, we want this bill now. It might have a change or two. Then it gets voted on by the full Senate. Then it has to go to what's called a committee that is between the House and the Senate. It's a conference committee, and they iron out the differences. That's a compromise. Then it goes back to the House and the Senate to get voted on again. If it passes, then it goes to the president.
So by that time, the buses are obsolete.
Exactly. And then the president, if he vetoes it, has to go back to Congress, and 2/3 of both the House and the Senate can override his veto, and it can become a law. Or the president can sign it, and it becomes a law. So I joke about this stuff. For something that was targeted at 4th and 5th grade kids on Saturday morning, they did a really good job of describing the process.
How does anything get passed?
Well, that's a good point. All right. And one reason things are tough to pass, if we talk about the Speaker of the House, okay? In the House, because they do set stuff up, the Speaker has a committee called the Rules Committee. And those are the Speaker's tightest compatriots. The Speaker controls the Rules Committee. And it does just exactly what you say. They decide all the rules on what's going to get debated and not debated. So if the Speaker says your bill, even though everyone loves it, I don't like it, it's not getting voted on. It will just sit there and die. The Speaker decides everything that gets done in the House. If you don't have a Speaker, nothing gets done. There's no schedule to vote on bills, to do anything. This is why last year, if you remember the controversy around the Speaker, the Republicans had such a slim majority. Kevin McCarthy, to secure the votes to become Speaker, had to agree to amend the rules, saying that at any time people could call a vote of no confidence on the Speaker. And you'd have to re-vote. That was new. To get enough votes from his caucus, he only had like a 4 or 5 seat majority, he gave them that. Lo and behold, last fall, a year ago, a couple of Republicans said, I don't like what you're doing, let's have a vote. And those 5 or 6 Republicans, plus all the Democrats, because they get to vote too on all this, sank his speakership. It's the first time that a speaker ever has been voted out of the speakership since our republic began. That was a big deal. And then if you recall, they proposed 1, 2, 3, I think Mike Johnson was the 4th person they proposed. While that was going on, nothing was happening in the House. Can't do anything. Yeah. And then finally, they cobbled together enough votes for Johnson. But if you actually follow the news, a lot of things that Johnson gets done now happens because the Democrats support him. That's why he hasn't been voted out. There's been a few Republicans who hate what he's doing, would love to pull a McCarthy again, but the Democrats don't want to do that again. They don't want to go 6 weeks without a speaker. So they are the ones who actually help him, along with the vast majority of Republicans, maintain his speaker role. Okay, but the speaker has a lot of power. If you think about Nancy Pelosi, she had a rambunctious caucus as well. You had blue dog Democrats. You had the progressive wing. She managed that caucus like nobody's business. She never lost a vote. Every time she decided to have a vote, she knew she had the votes to do it. And it's skill. She was awesome at it. Awesome at it. And again, nothing gets voted on, okay? So in the Senate, it's a little different. The Senate has this weird thing called the filibuster, all right? And that's part of the rules. In the 1800s, early 1800s, they drafted some of these rules, and you need 2/3 of the Senate to agree to change them. It's a lot. And one of the things they said is senators get to talk. We're all kind of equal here. So anyone can get up and talk. And you can talk and talk and talk and talk as much as you want. And they can debate. The longest filibuster was this guy, Strom Thurmond, in the 50s. He filibustered the Civil Rights Bill of 1957 to death. Literally killed it. He was a Democrat from South Carolina. He switched parties, I think, in the 70s, became a Republican. But he spoke for like 5 days around this. And it's political theater. And as long as he's talking, you can't stop him. You can't stop him unless you can vote to stop him. And this is what a filibuster is. It's in the rules that you can talk and talk and talk unless you get 60 senators to vote for something called cloture. That's the term. So everyone says, oh, the filibuster. You can filibuster, but if 60 senators say, Senator Thurmond, be quiet, please, sit down. We're going to call for a vote. And that's how it works. And that is in the Senate rules. Everything you have to have a vote on the Senate, you need 60 votes. They have carved out the budget process. You don't have to vote. They have 60 votes for the budget. You only need 50. Okay? But everything else had been this idea that you had to have a supermajority to have to vote on stuff. Why would they do this? Protects the rights of minorities, yeah. The minority party. What else should it promote?
I guess to give a lot of people second thought to think about it.
Second thought to think about it, compromise. You can't have extreme stuff go through. You'll never get cloture.
Mike, probably the best example of that is Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Yeah, it's a classic one. So now this is getting a lot of press the last couple of years, the filibuster. Get rid of it. It's a campaign issue. One of the candidates is on record saying, yep, I'd get rid of it. Get rid of it to pass certain types of laws. So how do you change it? First answer would be constitutional amendment or the president by executive order. This is a presidential topic of conversation from the candidates. So can you pass a law to change it? Or the Senate votes, majority rules. So the reality is it's not in the filibuster is not in the Constitution. Cloture is not in the Constitution. This is a Senate rule. They got together, they decided this is how we're going to run our chamber. All right? So you could have a constitutional amendment, I guess, that bans the filibuster. So I guess that might be right. The president has nothing to do with the filibuster. So when a presidential candidate says, I'm going to get rid of the filibuster, the president can't get rid of the filibuster. He can work with the Senate to do that, but has no power to do that. The Senate makes its own rules around this, okay? You don't need a law, it's just a rule. And the reality is, the real way you change it, you have to go to the rules of the Senate. And the rules of the Senate say you need 2/3 majority vote to change the rules of the Senate. That's tough. How are you going to get that to happen? Well, but you need 2/3 to get the rules to change. It's probably unlikely, but you can get around that. And they have gotten around that in a couple of instances. And it's called the nuclear option. Okay? So the Senate, because it's so rule-based and decorum-based, there's a lot of, like, Robert's rules on steroids around conducting meetings in the Senate. And they have this idea of, so you need 2/3 vote. So if enough people in the Senate decided this filibuster idea it's yesterday's news, we don't want it anymore, you could just vote to get rid of it. Then the rules would go away. You'd only need a 50 or a slim majority to pass laws in the Senate. The other way they can do it, they can create precedent, where they would call a vote on the ability to have cloture. One of the senators who is in charge of interpreting the rules would say, no, you have to have cloture to do this. And then someone would object and say, I don't think this is a good idea. And then the objection, you'd vote on that. If that passed by precedent, you would remove that bit of that lawmaking ability from the cloture rule. That's how they got the budget out of cloture. You don't need, and this is what happened very famously with Harry Reid and judicial appointments. Judicial appointments were subject to cloture. If the president propped up a Supreme Court justice, said, I want this person, you would need 60 votes to end debate to actually confirm the person. So it forced a president to kind of go with some moderate type people on either side. Harry Reid decided in the early, I think it was around 2010, Obama was getting all his judicial appointments. They never came out of cloture. The Senate just filibustered them. So it was getting frustrating to vote on stuff. And Mitch McConnell at the time said, well, send more moderate judges in and we'll vote on them. Harry Reid said, you know what? We're going to remove judicial appointees from the cloture rule through this precedent idea. And McConnell said, don't do it. You will regret it. Do not do it. And Harry did it. So he removed judicial appointees and the confirmation of them from this 60 vote rule. And now you only have to have a majority vote to appoint officials. And fast forward to Trump and his 3 Supreme Court nominees. Just needed 51 senators to get them through, and they all got through on the slimmest of majorities. Not a single one had a Democrat vote. If cloture still existed, none of them would have gotten through. None of them would have. So this is the nuclear option. And this is some of the things that get talked about on the campaign trail, whether to remove things from that. But exactly, it's be careful what you wish for. Be careful what you wish for, okay? Okay, and right now, these are the only two things that you don't need the 60 votes to pass. All right, now let's talk a little bit about representation. This is, again, the results of the Great Compromise. All right, senators, some senators represent a lot of people. If you're a senator from California, you represent 19 million people. If you're a senator from Wyoming, you represent about 800,000 people. How fair is that? If you're a senator from Wyoming, you wield an immense amount of power relative to the number of your constituents. Fair, unfair? It is the point. That's the point. Small states wanted to be represented. That's the point of the Senate. Now, a lot of people say this is ridiculous, but that's our system. That was the part of the Great Compromise. And this is the Great Compromise at work, right here. Right here. You're someone from Vermont, Bernie Sanders, he has as much to say as Chuck Schumer or Ted Cruz. Much to say, okay? So that's a big result of it, all right? Now, the House gets apportioned, okay? So again, they fixed by law the number of seats of 435. In the Constitution, it says that the Congress has to conduct a census. They have to count every single person in the United States every 10 years. So we got all that stuff in the mail, 2017, 18, something like that. That was part of the census count. And they all counted up. Okay? Every state has to have at least one representative, no matter how small the state is. Okay? But all the others, it's kind of done on average. And like I said, right now, they just take the number of people in the United States, they divide by 435, and it comes to roughly 750,000 people per representative. And then what they'll do is they will, every 10 years, they will reapportion members where they go.
What about illegal aliens?
They're not citizens, so they're technically not counted. Now,
No, it's not heads, it's citizens.
it's citizens. Now, the census now does count those people, yeah. And they do it, and I think Republicans tried to, under Trump, not count them. They were sued, and in court they said you have to count them. And you count them not for reapportionment, but to allocate government services. That was the ruling that came out. So they're a person. If money flows to help people, you know, they're people too. So that was the logic behind counting them. This is what happened in the last reapportionment. So if you look at this, this reflects where people are moving in our country. So 2010 to 2020, when they redrew the maps on where Congress got to be, so the little purple states, all kind of the Rust Belt, Northeast, including New York, lost one representative each, okay? And they moved to places down south. Florida picked up a representative, North Carolina. Texas got two. A lot of people moved to Texas. The interesting one is California. California, for the first time it's been a state since 1850, shrank. First time. They lost a seat. Hasn't happened in our country's history until this. They had been the steadily growing state, fastest growing state up until that time. They lost a seat. A lot of them moved to Colorado, Texas, Montana. Montana now has two representatives, not just one. They picked up a seat, okay? And this, so when they do this, now they have to redraw the lines in different states. So reapportionment, if you see that word, that just means how many representatives each state has. It's only done every 10 years. Okay? They've done some numbers. New York is still losing people. So is New Jersey. California is still losing people. If that trend continues, depending on how many leave, come 2030, they could lose some more representatives in Congress. Okay? But that's reapportionment. So when we think about representation, it matters because our congressperson can act in a couple of different ways. They represent us. We do not live in a democracy. People always talk about it. It's a democracy. No, it's not. We live in a federal republic, and we vote on people who represent us. Now, how do they represent us? We don't know, but generally speaking, they follow one of three different roles. One is called a delegate model. And a delegate model is supposed to be a representative who expresses the will of his or her constituents. So if the constituents want to move this way, the delegate model would say, I'm going to vote to move this way too. Whatever my constituents want, that's what I'm going to try my best to do, to express that. That's one model. Makes sense, right? But there's another model called the trustee model. This is the model that a delegate or a congressperson would say, you have entrusted me to represent you with all my flaws and my foibles. You know who I am. And while you may think we should do this, I'm going to use my wisdom and I'm going to decide we're going to vote this way. So a trustee model would be a delegate, or would be a congressperson who decides, I'm going to do what I think is best. And you can vote me out if you don't like it or whatever, but I'm not going to go with the whims of the people that change all the time. I'm going to steer a course, you know what I am, and I'm going to be consistent in my output on things. Then there's a third model that you'll see some people follow, which is called the Politico model. This is where a representative basically does what their party does. So if you're elected as a Republican, if the leadership says vote this way, you vote that way, or same for a Democrat. So you really are just partisan. You go in and say, I got voted in as a Democrat. You know what? Maybe this law doesn't really help my area, but I'm going to vote on it anyways. Okay? And that would be what you'd call a political model of representation. All right? And this really matters because the way this works is, you got to get stuff done. And the reality is, this is a graph of congressional job approval. It's not good. All right? So if you look here, it spikes up. It was running kind of in the 30s, 40s. It spikes up after 9/11. Okay? And then steadily erodes. It spiked up again after the financial crisis, very briefly, steadily erodes. And I love the 9%. That's pretty tough. 9% approval rating for Congress. So if you thought about this, should any congressperson's job be safe?
No, it shouldn't be.
Shouldn't be. But if you actually poll people, you say, what do you think of Congress's job? They stink. But then you flip the question, well, what do you think of your representative? They usually get, on average, 60-odd% approval ratings. We love our guy or gal. Love her. He's great. She's great. But the institution stinks. Again, why is that?
They don't get much through.
They don't get anything done. They don't get anything done. And part of that is we love our person, but they're almost immune to criticism. This is the people's house, or even the Senate. We vote on them directly. These are the re-election rates. 90-odd% go back. The institution, they think like 12% approval rating, and they get sent back every 2 years. They go back. Remove. And this is the average term of length of service. It's just been rising. I mean, if you did a little regression, it would have some, positive slope. It's just going up and up and up and up. They're going longer and longer and longer and longer. They just never leave.
What about term limits?
What about term limits? How would you get term limits?
It's like voting out your job.
That's a big deal. Term limits could happen, but you'd have to have a constitutional amendment. Which branch of government proposes amendments to the Constitution?
The one you're limiting.
The legislature. Good luck getting that happening. Now, I mentioned this in our Constitution talk last time. There's another way to propose amendments. You know what it is?
Well, the states should be able to propose it.
They can. There's something called a convention of states. If enough state legislatures say we want to call a constitutional convention, you need, I think it's 2/3. You need 2/3 to call it. They will have to go, just like in Philadelphia back in 1787, get in a room, and then they could come up with amendments. The founders knew that you had to have another way. The states had to be able to bypass Congress to do that. And I think the number is they're up to like the high 20s of state legislatures who have asked for a constitutional convention to do things like, Jeff, what you mentioned, put term limits on. Now, there's a lot of pushback around that. You want to know why? Sounds like a great idea, right? Term limits is something the vast majority of people approve in. If I ever ran for Congress, that would be my one issue I'd run on. That's it. It's a Pandora's box. Once you got all those people in a room, they don't have to stop with term limits. They can decide to change all sorts of different things. Now, it doesn't mean that it would get voted on. You'd still have to get 3/4 of the state legislatures to agree to it before it would become a law. But they could pick anything. And people say, I think someone said it earlier, be careful what you wish for. Right. If you have it, who knows where this could go? Maybe they'll do term limits, but who knows what else they could do.
It'll be a 3-minute term limit.
Yeah. Now, one of the reasons that these people keep coming back, because incumbency has huge amounts of power. And it's a lot of it's tied to money. Congress people spend an inordinate amount of time passing the hat around. Fundraising. That's what they do. Senators who run, because they're the most expensive campaigns, because you have to blanket an entire state. That's how much money they raise a day. $15,000 to get reelected. It's expensive. House people who are running in a seat like the congressional 7th district that is competitive, that's our seat, you got to raise a lot of money. It's expensive. $7,000 a day to do that. Okay? If you're not up for reelection, quite a bit less. But this is expensive. And if you're an incumbent, because you can do things for people, the way you vote, the way you apportion stuff, the way you, I didn't put this in the thing, but around pork barrel spending, earmarks, little goodies for my district, it helps you raise a lot of money. Incumbents have a huge advantage in raising money over challengers, and it's expensive to run a campaign. So that's a big, big reason why you never lose. You never lose. In the seat, you get the power to raise a lot of money. The other power you have is around this idea of gerrymandering. Okay? In the Constitution, one of the powers the states have is to run elections. That's what they get to do. And that's why, like right now, you're seeing all these different lawsuits in Georgia. There just was one in Nevada I heard about today. Arizona, Pennsylvania. All states create their own rules to run elections. That's their power. The only thing they have to do that the Constitution tells them to do, they have to hold federal elections every 2 years. Outside of that, they can do whatever they want, and any way they want to do it, okay? And that includes creating the districts on where their congresspeople will represent. And this ends up creating this term called gerrymandering, okay? And it's about manipulating the boundaries of a constituency to favor one party over the other. It's named after this guy, Eldridge Gerry. He was a founding father. He went to the Constitutional Convention. He actually voted against the Constitution. He was an anti-federalist. He ends up becoming the governor of Massachusetts. He actually was one of the guys, though, who really pushed hard for a Bill of Rights. You have Gerry to partially thank for that. But when he was governor, he switched parties. He was a Federalist, and he became a Democratic Republican. And he's like, well, Massachusetts, we're sending all these Federalists to Congress. It's like, nope, I'm redrawing the map. And he redrew it to get rid of the Federalists. And ever since, he's got, they've called it after him. It's called a gerrymander, okay? And so this is just a couple of wacky state boundaries that they do. They draw them all over the place. That Maryland 3rd District is around Baltimore, okay? Illinois 4th. There was a district, I think, in Ohio that ran all the way along the shore of Lake Erie, across the whole thing. There's just some really wacky things. And the states get to decide how their congressional districts are done. Some states do it as the legislature. Some states create laws to set up supposedly independent commissions to draw these things. Some states, the legislator appoints people to do this. It's all different methodologies to do it, okay? But because they do this, they have a lot of power in how people get elected. And this is an example of it, okay? So say you have 100 people, but you have 60 are blue, 40 are red, okay? If you wanted to have everyone perfectly represented, you would just draw your districts to include those populations. So you know you're going to get 40% of your delegates will be red, 60% will be blue. Makes sense, right? But if you do that, normally those people probably aren't going to live next to one another. You know, they're going to be spread out all over the state and stuff. You'll have those wacky, crazy, long line districts, okay? You can make something, so a lot of the theory is you want to have a constituency that live near each other. They're neighbors. They have the same issues. They have the same problems. So you want to have districts that are compact. But if you do that, you can definitely draw very compact but unfair districts. If you drew it like number 2, you wouldn't have a single red representative. You'd have 5 blues. The red people haven't gone away, but they never get, they don't have any say in their representatives. Now, you could also draw it, again, this is the power of gerrymandering. You could draw your districts where you actually can create a district where you get a red majority, even though they're only 40% of the vote, okay? You make 2 districts with a lot of blues, and then you make 3 districts that are just overweight on the reds and have a couple of blues that are left over. And there you have it. And that's what happens. That's what happens. This is another thing. They call it 2 different things. They call it packing and cracking. That's the theory. So packing does what I just suggested. You jam a ton of one party into a district. So, one district will have an overweight of one party. Sucks up all in this instance on the left, all the reds. So there are no blues represented in that one district, but now there's only a few reds spread out in the others, and you end up with one, two, three blue districts, only 2 red districts. The other way you can do it is called cracking. And cracking is where it's more subtle. You made overweight 1, and then you put the other districts in where the reds just barely don't have enough to win. And it's pretty sophisticated. It's a complicated question on how you do it. And there's been Supreme Court cases on how you do this too, on how you make this. There's a very famous case in North Carolina where the legislature said, look, we have a lot of African Americans in North Carolina. They're not represented. Let's draw a district that they did it where it was like, I guess it was really a packed district. They figured out there was one district, because there was a lot of African Americans in North Carolina, but they're the minority. So they jiggled a district, and it went all along some highway. And they said, yep, we've done it. Now we have a African American representative of Congress. We've accomplished our goal. Someone sued. What group do you think sued? White people sued. Said, you're discriminating against us. You have created a district based on race. And because you've created a district where you're favoring one race, you are, by definition, not favoring another race. Goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed that you can't gerrymander districts based on race. It's just like what happened with college admissions. You can use race as a factor in creating your districts, but you're not allowed, it can't be the dominant factor. It can be one of many that you can take into account. So what does that really mean in practice? What it really means in practice is the courts decide. You sue if you don't like it, and the courts decide whether it's appropriate or not. But this idea of gerrymandering is why, if you think about Congress, there's only really like 25 to 30 seats in the House of Representatives that are competitive. It's because of this. It's because of this. So you have very, very red seats. You have very, very blue seats. They're never leaving. They have to be challenged in the primaries to lose their job. And that happened in New York just this last year. But that's the only way. You win the primary in those districts, you're in. You're in. That's why, I have friends, there's some people who are out there on both sides. Their districts that they represent, they are never leaving unless they get primaried. So there's only like 20 or 30. And that's a reason why we have this idea of gridlock. A small percentage of Congress people actually really have to care, like what the swing voter thinks. Most Congress people don't care. They play to their base, and that's it.
Why is it so expensive?
Because Senate races, you can't gerrymander, right? They're statewide, so that's why they're so expensive. But in the seats that are competitive, you see the numbers like 3 times what the number is in other seats. Okay. So that's our system.
Is there any way to fix that?
Well, you can. One of the ways they talk about doing it is to make more neutral or nonpartisan systems to actually draw the lines when you're going to redistrict.
I'm talking about the cost of it.
Oh, the cost?
Yeah.
Well, this is where you get into, again, when we talk the SCOTUS, Citizens United. A lot of people blame Citizens United for having this explosion of money that's come into campaigns. The Supreme Court ruled that spending your money is a form of expression. And you can't stop it. So that has helped create this huge amount of money that's flown in. And, you know, I'm sick. I can't turn the TV on anymore. Literally every single commercial is a political ad. Right, I'm done. Yeah, I can turn it off. But if you can, so there is this thought of trying to lessen the effect of money, but that doesn't seem to be in the offing anytime soon, because it is they've ruled it's a form of expression.
Mike, was this even a consideration for the founders when they drew up the Constitution?
No, no. I think the thought was when they drew it up that if you didn't like your congressperson after 2 years, you'd get a new one. That's how it would work. You wouldn't have these people.
What about the senators then?
Well, I think that's a different concept. You know, why some states have become very red and some states have become very blue. That's this idea of the sorting of America.
Why can't a state have one red and one blue?
They can if they want to vote that way.
It doesn't work.
Yeah.
Mandate it.
But when we talk about articles or even the Constitution, there is not a single word in our Constitution about political parties. When they wrote the Constitution, political parties technically didn't exist. They are a creation afterwards, this idea of a faction. So they never envisioned it. Now, one thing they think of that could also help, anyone ever hear of what is it called? We have a system, most states run it first past the post. There's another way to vote, which is ranked choice voting. And there's a thought that maybe ranked choice voting could allow more, maybe break a little bit of this. I'm not sure. All right, last question. Is it a good or a bad thing, divided government? This idea that, you know, maybe the Senate's controlled by Democrats and the House is controlled by Republicans now, or Congress is controlled by one party, the presidency is controlled by another. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Why?
That's a tough question.
Why is it a good thing? Anybody? What do you think?
Compromise.
You have to have compromise, okay?
One party can't take over.
Absolute,
They have to compromise in their yeah?
absolute power.
Most of the evil in history has been done by governments.
Yeah.
The vast majority of it, actually.
Yeah.
The government's the problem?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I'm not an anarchist.
Yeah.
It is true.
Yeah. What's that? The stock market likes it. If you have divided government, yeah, it's hard to pass laws. Or laws that get passed, you have to have a lot of compromise. You probably get less laws, right, in divided government. Yeah. Does the answer change if you call it gridlock? Is gridlock good or bad?
Good. Then you get nothing done.
But isn't that part of divided government?
That's what you're hoping for.
It's gridlock. Nothing happens. Kind of changes your thought around it, right? Like divided government, a lot of people think there are real benefits for it. But one of the downsides of divided government is nothing gets done. Nothing gets done. And I would argue one of the reasons that they're at 12% approval rating is because nothing gets done. Like we sit there, I mean, I look out the window, we got problems. Right? People have different opinions on what the problems are. They don't seem to be working that hard to fix them.
So with 93% of all representatives coming from safe districts, even under gridlock, none of them are really in a position to say, I'm willing to compromise.
That's the problem. There is nothing forcing them to compromise. They're going back. And if they do compromise, their only danger to their nice seat is to be primaried. So if you compromise with the other party, your own party can run a challenger and boot you out. That's the danger that you face. So if you think about that, it makes you be even more extreme. That you never want to be outflanked in your party come the primary system. If you're a Republican, you're going to be as right as you can be. If you're a Democrat, you're going to be as left as you can be. Do not be outflanked. And it promotes that type of behavior in Congress. Don't have on your record that you crossed the line and you voted for the other side's bill. They will hold that against you in the primary. And that also endears this idea of gridlock. Fred.
A few decades back, I understand this whole idea of the unitary executive started coming forward, that the executive has more power to act independently. Is the legislature beginning to yield more and more of the powers that it was given?
That's a great question, Fred. There's a lot of political historians who say that Congress over time has given more power to the executive branch, particularly around foreign policy. If you think about it, if you go back to the express powers, only Congress can declare war. If you say that, well, then what the heck? We've got soldiers all over the place fighting. Last declared war in the United States? Anybody know? World War II. That was it.
The others were policing actions.
They're policing actions, or they're congressional resolutions that will support them afterwards. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, the War Powers Act in the 70s tried to rein some power back to Congress. So now the president they have authority to go in if they're for national defense. That's one of the powers they have. But then they have to report on it to Congress after, I think it's 90 days or something like that, if they send U.S. troops into harm's way. But that's not what was in the Constitution. And there's a lot of these ideas around executive orders, or the ability to do defense, where Congress has allowed the executive to take more power. But this idea when last time we talked about checks and balances. The legislative branch and the executive branch should both be fighting for more power. But over the course of the last, I'd say post World War II, the New Deal, the executive has actually accumulated more power, their ability to do things. And if you look at just executive orders as such, when we get to the executive, we'll talk about what those are. Loads more executive orders now than there used to be 50, 60, 70 years ago.
Oh, and as the judicial system, the courts lost power.
You could argue that, but you could probably argue the opposite too, as well, whether they have more power or not. The judicial branch. We're going to do a whole thing on the judiciary. But the judiciary, it's fascinating how they run things. Danielle?
I heard something once, and I thought it was interesting, talking about primaries and the crazies on one side and the crazies on the other. And it was an interesting take because this person was saying the reason we get the crazies at the final election is because fewer people vote. Most people are moderates and would probably, if as many people voted in the primaries as did in the election itself, we would probably have more moderate candidates, but it's the ones who are diehards on both sides that tend to vote more in the primaries.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. Primary voter turnout it's a fraction of the general election. And it's funny, my son's working for a campaign, and you get these walking lists, and it tells you doors you should knock on. And it tells you who's a strong R or a strong D, moderate R, moderate D. And the way they determine that is, does the person actually go vote in a primary? If they get up off their couch in May and they go vote, they're into politics, whatever party they are affiliated with. But most people aren't. And that's one reason. Another thought would be to do open primaries. That you do not have to be a member of your own political party to vote for a a candidate. And some states have it. New Hampshire is an open primary state. So, and that was the thing. A lot of Democrats came out for the New Hampshire primary and voted for Nikki Haley. They said, well, let's get Nikki Haley to win. They're not Republicans, but they have the ability to do that. And that is something that people have said, maybe if you do that, you get a more open system. But primaries, though, primaries are a function of the political party. The parties make those rules.
Plus, if you go independent, you can't vote in the primary.
Sure.
Yeah, except unless it's an open primary.
But in New Jersey, for independent, you can vote in the primary, and you, whichever, or it used to be this way, whoever you voted for, so say you went into the Republican Party, you automatically switched to Republican, and you had to go back if you wanted to get.
Yeah, Allison, I don't know that. I thought New Jersey was a closed primary system. Independents aren't allowed to vote. Yeah. Yeah, I think New Jersey, you have to be affiliated with a party to participate. But again, political parties make their own rules around how they create candidates. The classic, this will be talked about for 100 years. How Kamala Harris became the candidate for the Democrats. But the parties get to do it any way they want to, and people are outraged by it, or some people are. But people know like that the parties get to choose how they create their own candidates. So, you can be upset about it, but that's just the way it is. And the Republicans figure out the rules to choose their people too.
I got a question. You mentioned earlier about the presidency and that the power of the sword, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that he has the ability to direct the military to kind of the way he wants, but it's got to be, if there's got to be a war, it's got to be voted on by the Congress, right? But recently there was some press about the former chief of staff was undermining the president, didn't want to do what he wanted to do, and like let China know that there was something happening. So that undermines what the president does. But then the counter to that is a lot of warfare doesn't require troops. You can do it by drone. So if the president said, okay, I can push a button, I can get a drone to do the job that would require a large amount of people to do. It gives him a lot more power, especially he's got the power of the sword, and he also has a compliant military. That's a lot of power in the hands of one guy.
No, it is, but I would argue that if Congress doesn't like it, they can pass a law to say, no, you can't do that, or we're going to have oversight on your ability to do that, or what have you. They could do that. That would be the pushback.
But that would be a pretty severe measure, right?
Yeah, but if they're doing that, maybe it's deserved, right?
It is the power that they do have. They can do that. They might get a lot of bad press.
Yeah. When we talk, my next talk will be on the executive. The executive is an interesting branch because the executive branch is one person. That's it. One person. And every other part of the executive branch is created by Congress to help the president carry out his job. That's why they make it. Everything else is superfluous. All right. One last question.
One last question. Yeah, thank you, Mike. Go back to the founders. You said the U.S. Constitution was a first, a one of a kind. So where did the founders, the thinkers, go to come up with these ideas in terms of looking through ancient history or relatively recent? And then what part did they create beyond that?
As a plug, I think on the email you got advertising this, there is a YouTube video if you missed my talk on the story of the Constitution. A lot of that's in there. But to answer your question, Fred, they basically looked at a lot of Enlightenment philosophers. There was a lot of thought around the Enlightenment around how government should work. John Locke gets a lot of it. Montesquieu was a big person around checks and balances. But there are more than that. Voltaire, we have freedom of speech. A lot of it's because of Voltaire. He was a big proponent of like those basic kind of First Amendment type rights. So there's a lot of those thinkers, and they were big readers of all that stuff. They incorporated a lot of these ideas into it. But then when the rubber hit the road, they had to compromise about a lot of this stuff. Okay? A lot of that had to, it wasn't all theory. They had to hash it out. Yeah, Rick.
Ask one last question, and not to put you on the spot, but do you have any predictions for us on what's going to happen?
Tell us
Do I have any predictions? Well,
He takes the fifth.
yeah. I will. So the answer is probably my prediction would be no better than anybody else's. But I would just say, like, we have become so focused on what I would call horse race politics, which is basically a fixation on polling. Who's winning, who's not winning, where it's going, all that kind of stuff doesn't really tell you anything, because it's not a focus on issues. It's like who's winning, who's not. Polling is an art form. It's not a science. So whether it works or not, it seems. One thing I would say is Donald Trump is a different type of politician, and the way people respond to him when asked questions about him is different than pretty much every other candidate. If you look at what's happened in 16 and 20, he was his support was underrepresented in the polls. But I think, interestingly enough, pollsters aren't dumb. They do this for a living. So they're trying to turn the gauges to say, okay, what's the Trump effect? Is it 2%, 3% of those people who won't say, yeah, I love the guy, because they're afraid they won't get invited to cocktail parties? So what is that number? So I think if you look at what happened in 2022 in the midterms, they turned the dials, and they probably overrepresented support for maybe Republicans. That would be a theory, might be wrong, I don't know. But there was all this talk of a red wave that never materialized. So you could say maybe the pollsters kind of overcorrected. Now we're in 2024. Don't know. Have they overcorrected still? Have they dialed it back after 20? I don't know. Nobody knows until the best, I always say, the best poll when you count the votes. It's the only one that matters, right, in the end. But statistically speaking, Rick, it's a tie. The only thing where you're seeing any kind of movement, this didn't really exist 4 years ago, is in the betting markets now. Yeah, this is new. It's a new thing. You can put your money where your mouth is now and bet on probabilities of winning. And Trump has shown momentum in that over the last couple of weeks. The betting markets now rate him 2/3 probability of winning. But if you think about that, that still means Kamala has a 1/3, 33% chance of winning. That's not insignificant. I mean, in Vegas, that comes up a lot. So it's just a probability market. I think people like to look at it, maybe it's showing momentum, maybe the way things are working. Who knows? It's new. It doesn't mean that Trump will win because he has a 66% chance in the betting markets he's going to win. There's still a 33% chance he doesn't. So who knows what that is? But you got to vote. Go out and vote. They all matter. They all matter. All right? Okay. Thank you, guys.